Thank you very much. We're going to go next to Dan to tell us a little bit about LEAP, what LEAP has been involved with recently, and specifically what are some of the tactics and strategies that LEAP has used that have been effective to help convert a group that I think most of us assume is not very supportive of our issue, but perhaps we'll find out something different.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. As a currently serving police officer, I'm obligated to throw out a proviso before I say anything, and that proviso is simply that what I have to say here today comes from here. It's from Dan Mulligan. I don't represent the police organization that I work for in any way, shape, or form, nor can I, obviously. So that proviso is very important, and I have to throw that out every time I have any chats with anyone, to be honest with you. So all you Mounties taking notes out there, make sure you make note of the fact that I threw that proviso out there before you make your report to my boss in the morning. I'm here representing LEAP Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. That's a group that was started back in 2002 by a bunch of hard-charging former drug warriors, what we call drug warriors, guys that worked through the 70s and 80s and 90s and retired in early 2000. And these guys were frontline drug enforcement officers with various organizations: New Jersey State Police, Niagara Parks Police, Tonawanda, New York. There was 5 of them that got together in 2002 and said, something's wrong here, guys. We got to try and make an effort and start speaking out against this insane war on drugs. And I'm going to cheat for a few minutes because first of all, I got to admit, I'm not much of a public speaker, so I'm going to cheat and throw out the party line for you before I speak candidly. Just so that you know the specifics here, LEAP's mission is to prevent the multitude of unintended harmful consequences resulting from fighting the war on drugs and to reduce the incidence of death, disease, crime, and addiction by ending drug prohibition. LEAP's goals are to, 1, educate the public, the media, and policymakers about the failure of current drug policy by presenting a true picture of the history, causes, and effects of drug abuse and of the crimes related to drug prohibition. And 2, to restore the public's respect for law enforcement. And LEAP's strategy in accomplishing these goals are to create a speakers bureau of knowledgeable and articulate former drug warriors who describe the impact of current drug policies on police and community relations, the safety of law enforcement officers and suspects, police corruption and misconduct, creating and financing crime and terrorism, and treatment and prevention of drug abuse. Now, having said all that, I'm just a dumb Irish cop from Sudbury that is quite frankly tired of seeing our young folks saddled with the yoke of a criminal record around their neck for the rest of their lives for simple possession, P for P, trafficking, for having done stuff that quite frankly I did as a young man prior to joining my police organization. And interestingly enough, this was my police interview in early 1983, the first question asked was up in Sudbury, and a guy shows up in suit and tie, and this guy's a professional interrogator. So the first question he asked in my police interview is, okay, lad, I want you to tell me the full extent of your involvement in drug use. You grew up in Sudbury in the 70s. I want to hear about the full extent of your involvement in drug use. Not did you ever smoke dope or he's going for the throat right away. So I had to make a quick decision. Do I bullshit this man or do I tell him the truth? And it was an easy decision because this guy looked like he knew what he was doing. So I said, yeah, for sure. I've dabbled in a little bit of grass and a little bit of hash. I got through high school. I was a hockey player in Sudbury. I wasn't a smoker. I managed to get through high school without doing any drugs, but I ended up at Carleton University. I dabbled in a little bit of marijuana and hashish as an alternative to booze, and quite frankly, I found it for a while to be a pretty good alternative to a little excessive alcohol behavior that I was involved in at the time. So I asked the guy point blank, now that I've been straight with you, I said, is this a showstopper? He says, no, lad, that's not a showstopper. He says, it would have been a showstopper if you had lied to me. So thankfully, I had an interview by a fairly liberal-minded police officer back in 1983. And I've been fortunate in my policing career to have had a wide variety of policing experience. And I can honestly say that I have never, ever laid a charge of simple possession of cannabis in 31 years of policing, which I am still going. And believe me, that doesn't make me an anomaly among police officers. Believe me, the majority of police officers, I think if you catch them one-on-one, will be very honest with you in terms of how they feel about cannabis right now. And the vast majority of police officers are on the same page as each and every one of you that are here today, I dare say. And part of my motivation behind sitting here in front of you today, scared to death, quite frankly, because this scares me. Part of my motivation involves a young lad that showed up on my doorstep about 4 years ago in tears, and he had just had his first appearance in Bracebridge Court. And he says, Mr. Mulligan, I had known this kid since he was 5 years old. He'd grown up playing hockey with my young lad. He says, Mr. Mulligan, he says, I need your help. I said, what do you need? He says, I need a letter of reference to take to a judge on my next appearance. He says, I got caught with 10 grams on a ride check. I said, don't you worry, lad. I said, you'll get your letter of reference. And out the door he walked. I said, make sure you let your folks know what's going on right now, because this kid was obviously upset at the potential consequence of this particular charge. And he was pretty scared. So the letter went through and all that. But at the end of the day, I had been involved in a different avenue of police work for some time in the aviation side of things. And what shocked me at the end of that day was the fact that, one, we were still laying a charge of simple possession on the job, and it's still being done to this day, crazy enough. And the other was the fact that how many kids out there don't have a door to knock on for that reference letter. And those are the kids primarily why I'm here today, and why I'm essentially a Johnny-come-lately to this game. And I look at guys like John Conroy and Mr. Alan Young and Mr. Stroup down the road, and I have nothing but respect for these individuals, having dug into this in the past 4 years since that young lad showed up at my doorstep. I have nothing but respect for you people. The fact that you're here today suggests we're all on the same page. And I'm going to wear another hat later. Right now I'm talking about the LEAP hat. I'm going to wear another hat later in the discussion and discuss how we can all work together in getting over this hump and getting that big rock over the edge of the cliff.
Thank you very much. So next I'd like to go to Keith Stroup, who's with NORML in the United States. As I'm sure everyone has been aware, over the past, I guess, 5 years now, there's been some great success at the state level in terms of states full out legalizing recreational marijuana in Washington and Colorado, and also numerous states over the last 10 years who have seen the light of medical marijuana through large helps of NORML in the United States. So if you could just give us a bit of a rundown about what NORML is involved in, and specifically focusing on what are the tactics that have been effective from going from a fringe issue, if you will, to such a mainstream political issue in the last few years.
Thank you. First off, I want to remind people, if you don't have a history with NORML, that one thing that's a little bit different about us is we're a consumer lobby. That is, when we founded the organization in 1970, it was an outgrowth of some work I had done with Ralph Nader. Ralph had come to Washington, written his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, and he was sort of redefining how you would use your law degree. Instead of trying to just help individual clients, you try to impact public policy. Well, it was the height of the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. I was a draft evader and doing my best to not get my ass shot off in Vietnam. And I ended up, instead of going to Vietnam, I was fortunate enough, with the help of the National Lawyers Guild, to get a job working for the National Commission on Product Safety. And for 2 years, instead of going to Vietnam, I worked in Washington, D.C. at 16th and K. Now, why that's important is really for two reasons. One is, it radicalized me. I was like a lot of other people of my generation. I had expected to go to law school and go back home and practice law and get rich. I mean, I didn't know what practicing law was about other than attaining property. But the Vietnam War radicalized a whole generation in my country, and especially those of us who were coming out of school and were facing the draft. So when I had a couple of years to work around Ralph Nader, I was really freed up by the idea that maybe I could use what I had learned in law school. I had first smoked marijuana, by the way, when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School in 1965. I've been a regular smoker ever since, so I guess that means that I'm a long-term smoker now. So I decided I wanted to be a public interest lawyer. By the time the commission ended, I was too old to be drafted. I was 29. So I founded NORML. I wanted to be a public interest lawyer, but the issue that affected me and my generation was not so much product safety and auto safety like Nader, but it was marijuana legalization. We had all learned to smoke when we were in high school or college. I didn't smoke until I was law school, but it was identified with the protest against our policies in Vietnam. When you would go to an anti-Vietnam War demonstration, marijuana was passed up and down all the time. And if you didn't smoke it, you just passed it on. But it was perceived as a symbol saying the U.S. government has gotten way out of the mainstream on this and we need to bring them back in. Well, when the Gallup polling organization had asked the American public for the first time, the year before we started NORML in 1969, for the first time they asked the question of how many Americans support legalizing marijuana. Until '69, they didn't even think it was a serious enough question to ask. And when I look back at the results of those surveys, those polls, it's scary. It was only 12%. 88% of the American public supported keeping marijuana illegal. Only 12% supported what we were trying to do. Now, the reason I want to use that is to explain why we're now making progress in America. It's not because we have finally come up with better arguments, although I hope we've refined them a little over the years. It's largely because we have finally won the hearts and minds of a majority of the American public. And it's not because they're pro-marijuana. Only about 14% of the American public smoke marijuana. 86% do not. And you can't win this issue if you only depend on the support of the smokers. So what we have finally done successfully in America, we've convinced a majority of the non-smokers that prohibition is bad. That just as alcohol prohibition caused more harm to the country than the use of the drug they were trying to suppress, so has marijuana prohibition. Now, it's important to keep that in mind because as we go forward, it's not the committed stoner who we have to keep happy with how legalization works. It's the non-smokers, because otherwise, I guarantee you, we will have a backlash. We know from exit polling in America, especially from Prop 215 in California, when we got 46, almost 47% of the vote, but we lost that one. We found out from the people who refused to support that the two things that mostly concerned them, they weren't opposed to people being able to smoke marijuana and being left alone. They were concerned there might be a big spike in adolescent drug use, marijuana smoking, and that's something we can all identify with. None of us want young kids to be using any drugs. They do a lot, we know that. Most of them turn out okay either way, but I think it makes sense to have a policy that says you ought to discourage any kind of recreational drug use until someone is an adult. And the other area they're concerned about is DUIDs. They're concerned that you're going to have a big spike in the number of stone drivers on the road. Now, that's an interesting concept when you think about it. In America, in the U.S., I should say, we've got over 30 million Americans that smoke every year and 16 million Americans that smoke several times every month. Do they think we've been walking for the last 4 decades? For Christ's sake, we've been driving. So, I mean, I don't think it's a real problem, but that doesn't mean we don't have to pay attention to it. We do. We have to make sure that we are educating our own constituents that you cannot drive when you're impaired. And don't kid yourself. You don't drive better when you're stoned than when you're straight. You do drive better when you're stoned than when you're drunk. There's no doubt about that. But where you really don't want to do is, I'm a person, when I go home every day from work, if I'm not traveling, I pour a glass of wine and roll a joint and watch the news. Well, what the research shows is when you use those two drugs together, it's incredibly impairing. and it exacerbates the impact. So what we need to make sure is that we do not unintentionally allow our own culture to get the idea that it's okay to be stoned out of your gourd and get behind a wheel, because if there is a spike in DUIDs, there will be a backlash against further legalization, and it'll impact you people in Canada too, I assure you. Those are the kinds of things they're looking at. Now, again, one thing that's been incredibly important in the United States is that all of our change on social policy starts at the state level, and a little discussion Dana was having about BC leading the way here. Our states have a little more freedom, I believe. I don't know the Canadian system real well, but I think we have a little more freedom to experiment versus our federal government than you may have in Canada. But the one thing we do have to watch for in the U.S. is the supremacy clause of the Constitution. And what the supremacy clause says, in effect, is that if a state passes a law that the courts have said is in positive conflict, that's a legal phrase, but it means what you'd kind of think. You know, if the federal law says you cannot sell marijuana and the state licenses sellers, that's probably a direct conflict. And if you go into federal court, the courts would probably enjoin that. We were fortunate enough when we finally started reaching majority support for legalization in our country. And by the way, that was not until 2011. I told you when we started NORML, there were only 12% support. By 2011, the national polling, including the Gallup poll, started showing for the first time an actual majority. Over 50% of the American public said, I favor fully legalizing marijuana, not just for medical use, but for all adults. And that's continued to grow. The last poll a year ago from Gallup showed 58% of the country nationwide now support full legalization. So we are winning this because we are winning the hearts and minds of the American public. It's a slow process, but I think it's what you have to go through in any country to win. But the feds could have probably shut us down. They could have probably cut this whole momentum we built up, brought it to a halt. If they would have gone into federal court, argued the supremacy clause, they couldn't require a state to make it illegal to possess or use marijuana. A state can just remove their penalties. There's no doubt under American law. But they could have enjoined the part of the law where you license growers and sellers. And that's what this is all about. Consumers, again, we're a consumer group at NORML. We want marijuana that's convenient, safe, and affordable. And by safe, I mean I want it tested in a laboratory. I want to make sure there's no mold or pesticide. I want to know the CBD level and the THC level. And those are things that consumers in any other area want as well, but you couldn't argue that as long as marijuana was a crime. So it's only now that we're getting to the point where we can, at NORML, we can really kick into the parts of the issue that we would rather deal with. But again, I can't stress how important it was that the Obama administration elected, rather than to go in federal court and challenge what was happening in all these states. Remember, we have 21 states and the District of Columbia that have now legalized medical use. And we have 2 states that have legalized adult use, period. We're probably going to win Alaska and Oregon this November. And by 2016, I would bet we'll add 5 more states, probably California, probably Massachusetts, perhaps Rhode Island. And again, it's because the majority of the American people now agree with us. So thank God we had the Obama administration who was willing to say to their Department of Justice, stand back and let those states implement those laws if they can do it in a responsible manner. They issued a series of memoranda called the Cole Memo, and they had 8 different criteria. But essentially what they said was, if a state will make a reasonable effort to minimize diversion, that is, obviously, they don't want marijuana that's legally sold in Colorado showing up in Kansas and Oklahoma, and some of it's bound to, but you know, that's, you got to try to minimize that. And they don't want it as a cover to criminal syndicates. And there's always a little of that, people growing more than they're allowed and selling it out the back door. So in the U.S. right now, the medical or the legal marijuana industry, they want the bad actors out of the business. They want to bring this above ground. We want it to be a legitimate business. It works better for business and it works better for consumers. And none of that would have been possible but for Barack Obama's willingness to say, for the rest of my term, you people have a couple of years to prove you can do this in a responsible manner. And frankly, I don't care who's elected in 2016. I think by that point we will have made so much progress there is no turning back. So thank you.